And a glorious good afternoon to each and every one of you, or good evening. Um, I'm moving to chapter 7 of the Black AF History book by James Herriot. But again, be reminded and never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Because indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So don't be a sideline citizen, folks. Let's get in the game, get busy, and push back. Alrighty then. Chapter 7. The Black Emancipation Proclamation. A poem. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the bonds of servitude which have failed to define their existence, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the laws of God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of history requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to their actions. Only we held these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are, no, that we are, endowed by their Creator of all things with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are the only ones who ever believed that, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their authority from the consent of the governed. We do not consent. Whenever any form of government becomes untenable of these ends, it has been the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, dictates that governments long established should not be changed for life and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it has been the right and the duty of the people to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such was the simmering long suffering of African people in America. Their existence on this continent is a story of enslavement, oppression, and the most prolonged, undemocratic, heartless treatment of men, women, and children in the history of the human species. In every stage of these oppressions, the subjugated people collectively petitioned for redress in the most humble of terms. Their repeated petitions were answered only by repealed injury. Thus, a country whose national character is marked by every act that may define tyranny is unfit to rule a people. Nor were the oppressed wanting in attention from white America. The enslavers and their advocates were warned, from time to time, of attempts to extend the already unwarrantable jurisdiction over the permanently indentured population. They were reminded of the circumstances of their forcibly enslaved, who appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. The bondsmen conjured them by the ties of their freed kinsmen, their radical allies, and their common humanity to disavow the institution. Yet they too were deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. And also, this immature infant nation, being impervious to reason, logic, compassion, and self-realization, there came no other choice. The men for whom this country had withheld liberty and justice since the day it was founded had to save America from itself. They wanted that smoke. Signed the unanimous Declaration of These Hands by the black folks of America. As black people are acutely aware of cultural appropriation, the term, quote, after, end quote, holds a special meaning in the lexicon of poetry, specifically the African American spoken word genre. When a writer bases a poem on an already existing work or premise, the writer credits the original work in the introduction of the derivative piece by citing the initial author. Now, for example, when Najee Omar begins his 2015 spoken word pieces with, quote, poems are bullshit, end quote, he references the groundbreaking work, Black Art, in the title, the anti-poem, after Amiri Baraka. No one would have accused NBC of whitewashing a black sitcom and creating a hit show for Caucasian palates if the title card on the pilot episode of one of the most successful sitcoms in history could have read Friends after Yvette Lee Bowser's Living Single. In 1935, historian William Edward Burghardt Du Bois presented an entirely new historical perspective with the publication of Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward a history of the part which black folks played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America from 1860 to 1880. Challenging the notion of academics that portrayed Reconstruction as a failure, Du Bois posited that the post-Civil War era was a confrontation over economic and political power between the working class, in parenthesis, enslaved people, and the elite, in parenthesis, slave owners. The fourth chapter, titled, quote, The General Strike, end quote, was an even more brilliant and radical historical interpretation. In it, this great thinker put forth a new thesis that the enslaved black men and women helped win the war for eternal slavery simply by removing themselves from the economy that funded their proposed white supremacist empire. It was an interpretation so radical that many considered it downright preposterous, but it was, in fact, true. This is how the slaves freed America after W.E.B. Du Bois's The General Strike. In 1860, on the eve of what we call the Civil War, the 4 million enslaved Americans of African descent were the most powerful force in this country. Not only were these bondsmen essential to the production of food, cotton, rice, and church songs, but their simple existence had been leveraged to secure mortgages on real estate, businesses, and investment loans. More than 60% of the world's cotton came from the American South, as did the majority of American millionaires, all byproducts of chattel slavery. Their combined worth of $3.5 billion made black bodies the single largest asset in the national economy, worth more than 4 times the combined total of all the money in America. If you only counted the per capita wealth of the white population, 8 of the 10 wealthiest states held slaves. In less than 100 years, the forced labor of Africans had created an economic juggernaut. Now this rapidly expanding nation faced an existential crisis. No longer was the enslavement of human beings seen as a detestable but necessary evil. Canada, England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Mexico had abolished the institution more than a decade before the outbreak of the Civil War. It had not only become America's national shame, but was a threat to national security. Enemies of the state could potentially activate sleeper cells containing millions of dark-skinned allies with nothing but the promise of freedom, which had happened during the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. Remember that stuff you learned about Denmark, BC? It wasn't just a cool story. Vesey's supposed revolt sparked more crazy conspiracy theories than the Illuminati in Barack Obama's birth certificate, the craziest of which is that black ship workers from around the world were ready to join Vesey's rebellion. It all came to a head in 1822 when South Carolina passed the Negro Seaman Act, requiring all black sailors to be imprisoned when their ships were docked in South Carolina, equating the precedence of a free Negro flesh with a moral pestilence, which is to destroy the subordination of the slave and the state itself. The act even required sailors to pay for the time spent in the state's lovely jails or to be sold into slavery. When a circuit judge declared the law unconstitutional, South Carolina enforced it anyway, knowing it would never make it to the Supreme Court docket because of one Southern conservative and champion of white supremacy, South Carolina's radical pro-slavery political giant, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was arguably one of the most powerful men in antebellum politics, having served as a congressman, a senator, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and 2 terms as vice president. In 1828, Calhoun penned the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which introduced the idea that states could nullify federal laws, including tariffs, treaties, and taxes, that unfairly burdened the states that benefited from free labor, the earliest rumbles of the region's aversion to big government policies that interfere with, quote, states' rights, end quote, and the Southern way of life. If the South conceded to, quote, big government, end quote, and the campaign against the institution of forced labor, then the federal government could theoretically outlaw human trafficking altogether. John Calhoun wouldn't have it. South Carolina had already effectively nullified a federal judge's anti-slavery decision, and other states took notice. Eventually, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas passed laws that were identical to the Negro Seaman Act, effectively nullifying a federal judge's decision. In the Kansas and Missouri territories, a 5-year war between 1854 and 1859 had erupted over the possibility of slavery expanding into new states. At the heart of the conflict was whether Kansas would outlaw slavery when it became a state or ban the institution like its southern neighbor, Missouri. As Congress debated the matter, pro-slavery border ruffians went to war against anti-slavery free staters to voice their opinion on the issue in the most American way possible, killing anyone who disagreed. The white-on-white violence even erupted in Congress. The radical wing of the newly organized Republican Party was comprised of a few anti-slavery politicians who understood that war was the only way to eradicate such a profitable enterprise. While some white abolitionists opposed race-based servitude, most Republicans simply wanted to preserve the union of settler states they called America. Contrary to the dominant white people fought to end slavery narrative, few, if any, white men were willing to donate their lives to the cause of a free African American. Just as the founding fathers acquiesced to the South and excluded black people from the, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, when initiating the American experiment, most political leaders wanted to figure out a way to avoid a North versus South showdown, even if it meant denying black people's freedom. This centrist sentiment resulted in the election of President Abraham Lincoln, who admitted that his paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. Lincoln calmed fears of disunion by insisting that he had no plans to elevate black Americans, free or enslaved, to the status of white men. Quote, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the black and white races, end quote. Lincoln said in an 1858 speech. He also said, I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Sidebar, if you did not get Nixon's piano, you might want to search it up on Amazon and get that, because it talks about presidential politics from George Washington to Bill Clinton. Okay. Once again, I need to emphasize this, and this is still Lincoln. No one, not the Northern abolitionists, Lincoln, the Union Army, the Confederate turncoats, or the slaves themselves, saw the inevitable showdown as a battle to end slavery. Neither North nor South had, before 1861, the slightest intention of going to war, wrote Du Bois. The thought was in many respects ridiculous. They were not prepared for war. The National Army was small, poorly equipped, and without experience. There was no file from which someone might draw plans of subjugation. When Northern armies entered the South, they became armies of emancipation. It was the last thing they planned to do. The North did not propose to attack property. It did not propose to free slaves. This was to be a white man's war to preserve the Union, and the Union must be preserved. To explain how the country broke this intractable stalemate, historians often point to Lincoln's election, the nullification crisis, bleeding Kansas, the Missouri Compromise, or any number of social, political, and economic factors that supposedly set the nation on the path toward the war for white rights. Rarely mentioned are the black revolutionaries who escalated the national discord and further radicalized abolitionists and political figures of the period until the incongruity of a democracy that allowed human captivity could no longer be ignored. There are some who cannot wait for change and pledge themselves to the cause of dismantling the status quo with their own hands. When they are white, we refer to them as patriots or freedom fighters. When they are black, these unswerving agitators are most frequently painted as thugs or criminals. But if the informal nation within a nation known as Black America ever existed, then the preternatural instinct for survival and resistance that resides in the souls of black folks at that time must be described as a unique form of patriotism. They were more radical than all of the Republicans combined, and they were the driving force of the Southern economy. They were at once powerful and oppressed until they freed themselves, and in doing so, they saved America. They could not wait for deliverance, so they undid their own shackles. History is written by the victors, but it is made by the rebellious. This chapter is an ode to the great Black American Revolution. After Jimmy, after Denmark Vesey, after Nat Turner, after black people, and each of their small-scale uprisings and individual acts of dissertation, all of them. Previously, we talked about the American Revolution as the largest black uprising, but perhaps the greatest insurrection in America was ultimately the slow, steady trickle of men and women who used the Underground Railroad to secure their freedom. While history portrays the network of safe houses, abolitionists, and conspirators as clandestine and secretive, the real Underground Railroad used every available means, public and private, to transform slaves to free men. Sometimes they secreted slaves to Canada, while other times the buck contingent chose the path of knuckling. The acts of the black abolitionists frequently escalated to the point where white abolitionists disavowed their more radical black counterpart. Take, for example, the case of Shadrach Minkins. When white abolitionist lawyers failed to successfully represent escapee Minkins, the first person in New England seized under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, Boston's black leaders came up with a different plan. A gang of outraged black men burst into the courtroom, faces disguised, and wrestled Minkins away from federal marshals. Hiding him in the basement, the outlaws eventually helped the fugitive escape to Canada. 9 African American activists, including Robert Morris, the second black man admitted to the Massachusetts bar, were indicted and tried for treason, but were ultimately acquitted on all counts. This type of action was the Underground Railroad, too. Others, after Jebby, Nat Turner, and Denmark Vesey, tried to jumpstart nationwide revolts where black captives took up arms and went stono on the slaveholders. John Brown's brazen attack on the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on October 16, 1859, is often cited as the Civil War's first unofficial battle. John Brown, a white abolitionist, alongside a crew of around 20 insurgents, attempted to initiate an uprising, but they were quickly snuffed out by a company of U.S. Marines. These freedom fighters were later tried, and Brown was hanged alongside his co-conspirators. Brown was perceived as a tragic but delusional white man by those who were too blind to see that a reckoning was coming. Many Southerners took the incident as proof their captive property was not interested in taking up arms to fight. By the confession of Brown, it appears that the slaves were not parties to the plot, which, however, was concocted with the expectation that they would rise by the thousands and join in as soon as the first blow was struck, in which hope the conspirators were signally disappointed. And that read an editorial in the Kentucky Commonwealth newspaper. For one, we do not believe that many, even the most radical abolitionists, were encouraged in it, if they only knew. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, both of whom were self-liberated by way of the Underground Railroad, had quietly lent their support to Brown's mission. Brown had met with Douglass on more than one occasion, receiving messages, support, and money from him and his network. One of Brown's most trusted accomplices, Shields Green, actually met Brown while living at Douglass's home. Harriet Tubman provided strategic support, reconnaissance, and recruits for Brown's mission. She might have been with Brown if she had not fallen ill days before the Harper's Ferry raid. And just before Brown set out for Harper's Ferry, he met with Moses Dixon. Upon hearing Brown's plan, Dixon, quote, tried to dissuade Brown by telling him that the time had not yet come, end quote. If anyone would know, it would have been Moses Dixon. Born free in 1824, Dixon trained as a barber and began touring the South at age 16 before becoming an ordained clergyman in the AME Church. On August 12, 1846, he gathered 11 other black men in order to develop a 10-year strategic plan for a national uprising that would end slavery. The Knights of Liberty took an oath, swearing, quote, I can die, but I cannot reveal the name of any member until the slaves are free. End quote. The membership would eventually cover every slaveholding state but Texas and Missouri. Many of the founding members managed stops and funded the Underground Railroad, which also provided the Knights of Liberty with a system of messaging, recruiting, and freeing potential members. After 10 years, the men had enrolled 47,240 reliable, fearless Knights of Liberty who had been drilled in military maneuvers and were courageous, patient, temperate, and possessed of sound common sense. They planned to have a concentration of forces in Atlanta, where they expected to have 200,000 forces march on the anti-American traitors from the South. A day was set, Dixon explained, but before the time came, it had become apparent to the leaders that the relations between the North and the South were becoming so strained that it was decided to postpone our rising. Many of the members would join the Union, fight and help freedom seekers throughout the Underground Railroad. After the war had settled the question of Negro freedom, the name of the order was changed to the International Order of 12 Knights and Daughters of Tabor. Continued revolts, escapes, and acts of rebellion didn't just bring the country closer to civil war. These incidents helped secure victory for the Union, although that was never the main goal of the enslavement. Again, the slaves were on the side of freedom. Just as the throwdown between the Patriots and the Loyalists provided an excuse for Africans to liberate themselves during the Revolutionary War, the political and economic arguments between the Southern slave masters and the Union preservationists were immaterial to the black bondsmen held captive below the Mason-Dixon line. For them, armed conflict provided the perfect opportunity for emancipation by any means necessary. Given a choice between being part of America and owning slaves, the South chose treason and secession, sending the nation into what still stands as the bloodiest war in the history of this country. This war was won through the efforts of the escaped slaves, whose mere absence would eventually cause the economic collapse of the Southern Empire. Yet when their war for unending enslavement began, the South considered their human property an advantage. While there is no evidence of black soldiers fighting on behalf of the Confederacy, enslaved men and women were used as cooks, laborers, and personal attendants in the military. So in many respects, it was these very black people they forced into labor who best undermined the Confederate States' military effort. Take, for example, the case of enslaved Charlestonian Robert Smalls. As soon as the war began, Smalls was assigned to helm the Confederate transport boat, the CSS Plancher. Although the color of his skin prevented him from becoming a wheelman, Smalls became one of the most experienced naval helmsmen in the Carolinas. For nearly a year, he steered the ship, surveying waterways, delivering troops, and carrying supplies throughout Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. On May 12, 1862, while picking up 4 large guns in his hometown, he and the enslaved crew stayed on board the vessel while the white men luxuriated around Charleston. But Smalls had a surprise for everyone. They were getting the hell out of South Carolina. Around 3 a.m., Smalls found the captain's uniform and straw hat and calmly sailed past the Union blockade, replicating all of the captain's signals at every checkpoint. He circled back to pick up his family, along with the families of his fellow crewmen. The other crewmen tried to convince Smalls to avoid Fort Sumter, the Confederate stronghold and site of the war's first battle, knowing that it would be filled with soldiers and seamen. Smalls refused. insisting that he should take the normal route lest he arouse suspicion. Instead, he flashed a signal to pass the Fort Sumter checkpoint. When there was no response, everyone on the boat dropped to their knees and began praying and crying. Robert did not. He kept going and was allowed through. Before they reached the Union's naval blockade across the harbor, Smalls took a bed sheet, tied it to the flagpole, and hoisted it in the air, alerting the sailors of the Union vessel, the Onward, that they were not enemies. When they discovered that we would not fire on them, there was a rush of contraband out on her deck. Some dancing, some singing, whistling, jumping, and others stood looking toward Fort Sumter and muttering all sorts of maledictions against it and the heart of the South generally. One of the Onward's crew explained. One of the colored men stepped forward and, taking off his hat, shouted, "Good morning, sir. I brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." That man would introduce himself as Robert Smalls. A week later, using information provided by Smalls, the Union forces took the Stono Inlet and occupied it until the end of the war, eventually leading to the capture of South Carolina. Even Lincoln was impressed. Little could he imagine that Smalls would not only dismantle his edict against enlisting escaped slaves into the Union Army, but in 1868 became one of the first black men elected to Congress, undermining Lincoln's 1858 position against making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office. When the fighting started, Union military leaders were unprepared for the influx of escaped slaves, ready to open long-preserved cans of whoop-ass on their pro-slavery taskmasters. The debate over the legal status of contraband, like Robert Smalls, was as contentious as the ongoing debate over the value of black lives. In 1861, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Malloy stole a skiff near the spot where the White Lion landed with the first enslaved Africans in America. The enslaved men had been released to the Confederate Army to defend batteries in Virginia. Instead, they rode to Union-occupied Fort Monroe and presented themselves to Major General Benjamin Butler. When scouts informed Confederate Major John B. Carey about the escape, he requested the return of his leased property. Butler refused. Trained as an attorney, Butler explained to the un-American troop leader that since Virginia considered itself an enemy combatant, the rules of war dictated that the men were now property seized during formal hostilities. Following Butler's informal declaration, Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, stripping Confederate volunteers and their co-conspirators of their enslaved property that managed to reach Union-occupied spaces. A few months later, Union Major General David Hunter issued General Order No. 11, declaring, quote, "The 3 states of Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, comprising the military department of the South, having deliberately declared themselves no longer under the protection of the United States of America, and having taken up arms against the said United States, it becomes a military necessity to declare them under martial law." This was accordingly done on the 25th day of April, 1862. Slavery and martial law in a free country are altogether incompatible. The persons in these 3 states, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, heretofore held as slaves, are therefore declared forever free. According to established military tradition, Butler and Hunter were technically correct, but the implications were enormous. If the runaways were, quote, contraband of war, end quote, then by extension, The Army, not Lincoln, held authority in the Confederate States of America. Butler and Hunter's acts incensed Lincoln. He had no intention of wading into the fight over slavery, knowing it would exacerbate the resistance of the already incorrigible slave-holding states. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it, Lincoln explained. He explained that to the New York Tribune editor, Horace Greeley. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the union. Lincoln quickly rescinded Hunter's order, but it was too late. The Confederate States were officially recognized as a separate entity. But General Hunter's controversial order that would eventually set Lincoln, Congress, and the Union forces on the path toward enlisting free black recruits and emancipating slaves was not his own idea. Hunter often consulted with a battlefield nurse who had been helping slaves flee to freedom, enlarging Hunter's crew of renegade soldiers. Hunter had even been paying her, but after the Army stopped Hunter from recruiting black soldiers, she gave up her salary so she wouldn't be seen as Hunter's favorite. Instead, she baked pies in the evening to sell to the white soldiers. Re-enter Harriet Tubman. The famed conductor of the Underground Railroad was instrumental in Hunter's success in the South. Tubman's years of experience facilitating escapes gave Hunter access to a veritable super soldier. Tubman could map the terrain for other troops, gather intelligence from the enslaved, and lead reconnaissance missions without being detected. Clearly, understanding the advantage black soldiers gave the Union, Hunter continued to antagonize the treasonous Southerners, enlisting their fugitive slaves to fight against them. In 1863, Hunter would ruffle even more feathers, writing Confederate President Jefferson Davis directly. Quote, "You say you are fighting for liberty. Yes, you are fighting for liberty. Liberty to keep 4 million of your fellow beings in ignorance and degradation. Liberty to separate parents and children, husband and wife, brother and sister. Liberty to steal the products of their labor, exacted with many a cruel lash and bitter tear. Liberty to seduce their wives and daughters, and to sell your own children into bondage. Liberty to kill these children with impunity, when the murder cannot be proven by one of pure white blood. This is the kind of liberty, the liberty to do wrong, which Satan, chief of the fallen angels, was contending for when he was cast into hell." Now, Jefferson Davis had already ordered Hunter to be executed, but he evaded capture. The War Department and Congress eventually came around to Hunter's line of thinking and formally enacted legislation through the two Confiscation Acts. The first Confiscation Act, signed on December 2nd, 1861, authorized Union troops to seize rebel property, which of course included slaves. The act authorized the troops to consider slaves as contraband, but did not specify their status. The second Confiscation Act of 1862 clarified the position of the escaped slaves to anyone engaged in the rebellion against the government of the United States, and the slaves of anyone who shall in any way give aid or comfort to Confederate contraband, declaring that all escaped slaves in Confederate territory shall be deemed captives of war and shall be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. With these acts signed into law, the Emancipation Proclamation, enshrined in white history as the document that kick-started the freeing of slaves, was essentially a formality, a performative gesture by a president who didn't have the authority, the intentions, or the backbone to free the people he had deemed inferior. By 1865, the Union Army was managing more than 100 contraband camps to deal with the steady stream of escapees. Somewhere between 8 and 15,000 seekers showed up in New Bern, North Carolina, from which William Henry Singleton recruited at least 1,000 black soldiers. After the Union capture of Roanoke Island, North Carolina, freed men established their own self-sufficient town, the Roanoke Island Freedmen's Colony. But the largest of the refugee bases was at the site of a town west of Fort Monroe, Virginia. After 10,000 slaves turned themselves into freedmen by escaping to Phoebus, Virginia, Mary Peake, a free black woman, began gathering adults and children under an oak tree to teach them how to read. By the time the formerly enslaved gathered under the tree to hear Lincoln read the Emancipation Proclamation, they had transformed the Grand Contraband Camp into one of the first official self-contained black communities in America. Mary Peake's oak tree would become known as Emancipation Oak, and Peake's lessons would become the cornerstone for the historically black institution, Hampton University. The ranks of the Union Army swelled with freedmen willing to fight. Among the approximately 185,000 black men who volunteered for the Union Army, 93,796 were from Confederate states. 16 were awarded the military's most prestigious decoration, the Medal of Honor. The 175 regiments of the United States colored troops gave the Union a decided advantage. The contingent of black Union forces included the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, immortalized in the movie Glory, and the Corps d'Afrique, a Louisiana unit formed after land-owning free black men were banned from joining the Confederate Army. And it wasn't just the men who provided the military advantage. Everyone knows that Harriet Tubman had a thing against slavery, but most people don't know that during her time as the Civil War scout and nurse, she freed even more slaves than she did as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. On June 2nd, 1863, Tubman became the first woman, black or white, to lead a U.S. military operation directing an armed assault during the Combahee Ferry raid. Leading the 150 black soldiers from Beaufort, South Carolina, Tubman provided reconnaissance and helped 3 gunboats dodge Confederate mines. Once they reached their destination, the men eased off the boats and attacked the Haywood, Middleton, and the Lowndes plantations, 3 of the South's largest agricultural slave camps. They burned the rice plantations to the ground and filled the Union steamboats with more than 700 instantly freed bondsmen. Not one soldier was lost. Meanwhile, Mary L'Ouverture, sometimes Tolestray, not only helped millions of enslaved people taste freedom, she changed the history of warfare in the process. The battle for naval supremacy was crucial in the war of slaveholder aggression. Excuse me. Prior to this era, sea battles were contests between easy-to-sink, extremely flammable wooden ships, and it likely would have stayed that way if not for Mary L'Ouverture, a free woman who was a talented artist. Not only could L'Ouverture sketch, but she was a gifted seamstress, which is how she wound up in the home of a Confederate engineer, whom she overheard discussing a plan to reinforce a salvaged Confederate ship with iron. Lois Stray knew that this idea could turn the war for the South, so she copied the drawings, hid them under her dress, and asked for permission to visit her previous owners. She traveled to the nation's capital, where she received a military escort to meet with officials from the Department of the Navy. When the commander of the Norfolk station heard of her bravery, he asked the Navy secretary to offer Lois Stray any reward which her services might be thought to merit for her brilliant and courageous act. The Union used the information to speed up the production of the USS Monitor, which would face off with the CSS Virginia, previously the USS Merrimack, in the world's first battle between two ironclad ships, signaling a new era of naval shipbuilding. The battle made worldwide news and ushered in a new era of water-based warfare that gave the Union Army a clear advantage on the seas. For her efforts, Mary received a thank you letter. Tubman, Lois Stray, Smalls, Minkins, and countless other names lost to history, risked their lives for Black America. The South would incur devastating financial losses because hundreds of thousands of slaves have absconded from Confederate homes and forced labor camps. Remember, the black servants were much more than just labor. They held the intellectual property that created the billion-dollar agricultural industry that would have made the Confederate States of America the fourth wealthiest in the world, ahead of every European country except Britain. Their bodies secured the loans and mortgages that made the lower Mississippi Valley home to more millionaires than anywhere else in the United States. In terms of stopping the expansion of slavery, Denmark Vesey's revolt was actually successful. The black Free Staters ensured that Kansas was admitted as a free state. The people who were enslaved were the power and the might of the South. The Union Army never intended to free the slaves. Lincoln didn't want to free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation couldn't free the slaves. Black people freed themselves, and in doing so, they defeated the Confederacy and freed America from its most undemocratic institutions. They were less concerned with flags, taxation, or saving the Union than they were with saving their people. Still, the result of their actions was a victory for America. The freed slaves would come to literally define what it means to be an American. We are the ones who continually push this country toward its goal of becoming more perfect. We are the reason it is still a union. If our existence has a purpose, if the universe has meaning and is not a series of random things that happen, it cannot be a coincidence that the first, quote, contrabands, end quote, rode a stolen boat on the exact same path as the white line. Nor unfathomable is one of the first self-sustained black communities began where the English colonizers established their first settlement. It is impossible to believe there is no significance to the capital of the slave trade's ultimate undoing coming from the cunning of slaves who trafficked themselves to freedom. If this was a work of historical fiction, having Harriet Tubman radicalized General David Hunter into issuing a bootleg Emancipation Proclamation would be too unbelievable. Excuse me. The fact that Robert Smalls steered the planter to Fort Sumter for the ceremonial raising of the American flag, signaling the end of the Civil War, would seem like a fairy tale if it were not true. Having him represent South Carolina in the House of Representatives is almost too much, especially considering that part of the reason he won was his ability to speak the Gullah language. That he was the leading colored delegate the South Carolina's Constitutional Convention after the Civil War is too on the nose. These stories seem like a metaphor for something exponentially larger. But this is a point. And remember, America is just a story. And this is a point after black people. The supplement to Chapter 7, The Lost Cause Explained. Explained like I'm a racist 5-year-old. Began as a takeoff of the popular subreddit Explained Like I'm 5, which simplifies complex issues into easily understandable, digestible bites. While it was meant to break down the complicated issues of race, economics, and politics into a conversational form that even a bigoted toddler could understand, the character only known as Racist Baby soon became one of my best friends. Although his parents seemed a little bigoted, RB often stops by, unannounced, and peppers me with questions. I tolerate him because I feel it is my duty to prevent Racist Baby from becoming Racist Man. Hey, Racist Baby, why are you carrying a cape? Well, my daddy keeps telling me the South shall rise again. I'm from Mississippi and I just wanted to make sure I'm ready when I get the ability to fly. No, my little baby bigot. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're probably not. No, my little baby bigot. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're probably not going to grow wings. Your dad is talking about the Confederacy. What is the Confederacy? The Confederate States of America was created in 1861 when 11 southern states decided that they no longer wanted to be part of America. So they took their ball, and by ball I mean slaves, and left, prompting the Civil War. They referred to it as seceding, which sounds nobler than what it really was. It was treason. When I was 12, I told my mother that I was no longer subject to her rules, and she had no dominion over my bedroom because I was seceding from the household. Just as the southern states found out, secession did not go well. Why did they secede? Slavery. And that's it. Just slavery. But my textbook says it was about states' rights, not slavery. How do I know you're correct? Well, they actually wrote it down. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to commit treason by officially declaring that its citizens didn't want to be part of the United States if it meant they couldn't treat black people as property. The declaration of the immediate causes which induced and justified the secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union was written as if it was a sequel to the Declaration of Independence. But instead of spelling out their grievances against their version of the tyrannical Great Britain, their entire list was just a variation of, y'all won't let us have slaves. The government had denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. The Carolinians won. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to enloin the property of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. You know what? Now that I read that, you might be right. It was only about slavery. South Carolina left the Union in part because Northern abolitionists apparently kept reading books and showing pictures to enslaved people. My bad. They probably promoted the myth of the lost cause. Okay, Racist Baby says, how'd they lose their cars? I thought they rode horses back then. No, racist baby. The lost cause is an ongoing ideology that promotes the Confederacy as a valiant cause undertaken by brave men. They believe the Civil War wasn't about slavery and the Confederates weren't racist. A racist baby asked. But my dad says slavery wasn't racist because things were different back then. Therein lies the problem. Even if your ancestors didn't think of it as evil back then, we do now. Championing a bygone era that fought for human bondage is like sitting back and fondly remembering the good old days when a man could beat his wife for burning the pot up. The racist baby asked again. So Confederate symbols are racist because they symbolize slave owning? Answer. Not quite. Although the entire reason for the Confederacy's existence was to preserve the peculiar institution of black people as human chattel, most Confederate symbols have absolutely nothing to do with the Civil War. The racist baby again asked. I don't think that's right. My grandpop has a Confederate flag, and he says it represents our heritage. Want to see a picture? Answer. Oh, that's not the Confederate flag. The first Confederate flag looked almost exactly like the U.S. flag, except it had fewer stripes and stars. But the United Confederation of Slaveholders hated that flag because it resembled the American flag, and in battle, they were hard to tell apart. In fact, we've probably never seen any of the actual flags that officially represented the Confederate States of America. The Confederate flag you're talking about originated from a design by William Thompson in 1853. And for him, there was no confusion about the true meaning of the flag that has now come to represent, quote, Southern heritage, end quote. He said, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematical of our cause. He called that flag the white man's flag. But that was revised into a third version, and the proliferation of that flag is all thanks to a group of white frat boys. According to historian Leroy Stafford Boyd, in 1812, a group of University of North Carolina students founded the fraternity Ku Klux Adelphon, the official name of an order that also went under the name of Circle of Brothers, Kappa Alpha, Ka, and the Alpha Society. Kappa Alpha began to emerge with independent chapters throughout the South until the fraternity essentially went extinct just before the Civil War. In October 1865, defeated Confederate General Robert E. Lee officially became president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. 2 months later, on December 21, 1865, a new Kappa Alpha Order was founded there. Confederate veteran Samuel Zenas Amen is celebrated as the frat's practical founder because of his idealization of Lee and the Confederacy as described in early KA literature. Quote, Southern in its loves, it took Stonewall Jackson and Lee as its favorite types of the perfect knight. Caucasian in its sympathies, it excluded the African from membership, end quote. And what better symbol for the fraternity than the star-sprinkled banner flown by the great white knights, Lee and Jackson? The flag you know as the Confederate flag is actually the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of General Robert E. Lee. The new KA wasn't limited to college campuses either. Members could form chapters called clans in surrounding counties to create a circle of brothers. 3 days after Kappa Alpha's 2.0's founding, 6 men, including former Confederate soldiers, gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee, and started a spin-off fraternity that, according to Leroy Stafford Boyd, was also based on the old Kappa Alpha rituals. This group modified the name of the original Kappa Alpha and translated it to the brilliantly pronunciation from the Greek kaklos, meaning ring or circle, and clan, meaning brothers or family. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. In multiple issues of the group's newsletter, The Journal, a heralded Kappa Alpha Order alumnus, Thomas Dixon Jr., insisted that Kappa Alpha need not fear to claim credit for suggesting the movement that culminated in a Ku Klux empire. Dixon would also famously start to get women involved in the organization. Racist Baby has another question. It says, wait, I didn't see any ladies at my dance meetings. Answer. Well, my little kindergarten Klansman, that wasn't always the case. In 1894, about 70 miles from where the Klan was founded, a group of white women united disparate pro-Confederate groups under the umbrella called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Instead of terrorist activities, these women had a more targeted approach to venerating the Confederate symbology. While the ladies affiliated with the United Daughters of the Confederacy did not create or substantially contribute to the precepts of the lost cause mythology, this group of white women was largely responsible for mainstreaming it. In fact, here's a quote from Thomas Dixon speaking directly to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Quote, every clubhouse of the United Daughters of the Confederacy should have a memorial tablet dedicated to the Ku Klux Klan. That would be a monument not to one man, but to 550,000 men, to whom all Southerners owe a debt of gratitude for how our beloved Southland could have survived that reign of terror. And that's a big question. The quote, lost cause, end quote, was always a part of clandestine white supremacist clubhouse dogma, but it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy who supercharged it with one of the most successful marketing campaigns in American history. Historian Karen Cox argues that the, quote, Confederate tradition, end quote, as we know it, was formed by these organized groups of white women who wanted to perpetuate the myth that, quote, states' rights, not slavery, caused the Civil War, end quote, by painting an idealized portrait of the antebellum South, one that romanticized white paternalism and African American slavery and glorified the valor of Confederate soldiers. And clearly, that belief is held. According to a 2019 Washington Post SSRS poll, 41% of Americans believe the Civil War was about something other than slavery. Wow. A July 2020 Morning Consult poll showed that 43% of Americans believed the Confederate flag was a symbol of Southern pride. Only 39% agreed it was a symbol of racism. Racist Baby asked, how did they do that? Answer, by casting white supremacy as part of Southern values. They started by lionizing white supremacist turncoats as champions for Southern culture. Have you ever seen a Confederate monument? Racist Baby. Of course, I've seen a lot of them. That's what we do on vacations. They're like my Confederate Army figurines, but bigger. My mommy says I should see them all before they're all torn down and our history is erased. Response. Well, this is going to take a while. A 2016 analysis by the Southern Poverty Law Center found 718 monuments and statues to Confederate icons on public property across this country, the vast majority of which were founded by one group the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Most of these statues were erected more than 50 years after the Civil War. In fact, when the SPLC, that's the Southern Poverty Law Center, looked at the history of these monuments and the places named after Confederate icons, they found that the surges in dedications and namings coincided with two periods. The first began around 1900 and includes the institution of Jim Crow laws and the nativist movement of the 1920s that revived the Klan after its immediate formation. The second began in the early 1950s through the late 1960s during the segregationist backlash against the civil rights movement. Between these two eras, the United Daughters of the Confederacy focused their efforts on fundraising, building their ranks, and spitting on black kids who tried to integrate their schools. The United Daughters of the Confederacy partially funded the largest shrine to white supremacy in the history of the world, a more than 12,000 square foot carving of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, located at a stone quarry just east of Atlanta. In 1915, at the place now known as Stone Mountain Park, landowner Samuel Venable granted perpetual rights to the Ku Klux Klan to hold meetings, formally kickstarting the modern era of the KKK. Helen Plain, the United Daughters of the Confederacy charter member who conceived the Stone Mountain Memorial, initially intended for it to include the Klan because, as she told the initial sculptor, I feel it is due to the Klan which saved us from Negro domination and carpetbag rule, that it should be immortalized on Stone Mountain. Why not represent a small group of them in their nightly uniform approaching in the distance? The first sculptor hired to carve Stone Mountain was selected to begin his work in 1916, but ran out of time and money. But after the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision brought desegregation to Georgia, donations poured into the UDC's coffers, allowing them to complete their work. The park finally opened as a tourist attraction on April 14, 1965, exactly 100 years to the day after President Abraham Lincoln was shot by a white supremacist. Racist baby. Wow, that timing is a little funny, but maybe they really loved their veteran. Response. Oh, my little Confederate kiddo. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was as concerned about preserving the memory of Confederate soldiers as your dad's choir members are concerned with roasting marshmallows on flaming crosses. By the turn of the 20th century, many of the women who were actual wives and daughters of the Civil War veterans were either dead or suffering from bouts of the vapor. But instead of disintegrating, the United Daughters of the Confederacy saw a surge in membership, fueled by the growing determination to separate the races with Jim Crow laws. At the 14th annual meeting of the North Carolina Division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, one of the speakers extolled the organization's virtues. Quote, "You were the song of the Old South. You are the theme of the New South. And today, in this high hour of peace and commercialism, when men are prone to forget, we find you banded together, United Daughters of the Confederacy, all still loyal to Southern rights, democracy, and thank God to white supremacy." Racist baby says, are you saying that they brainwash people into loving the Civil War's losing side by building statues and waving the flag? Response. The new generation of Southern belles were less concerned about memorializing veterans and they were about institutionalizing the tradition of white supremacy that the army of racists fought to uphold. And the statue thing was only one part of their campaign to brainwash people into venerating white supremacists. The UDC's plan was multi-layered. Their National History Committee organized propaganda campaigns in school districts across the country, including its annual essay contest that rewarded children who wrote glowing reviews of the South's disbanded slave-owning utopia. They also sponsored parades, placed Confederate flags alongside the U.S. flag in schools across America, and even founded Children of the Confederacy chapters. But perhaps the daughter's biggest impact was the way they shaped how kids like you learn about slavery. No single organization influenced the way educators teach the antebellum South and the Civil War more than the United Daughters of the Confederacy. By World War I, the UDC had more members than any teachers union, parent-teacher association, or historical society in America. The UDC's History Committee eventually became so powerful that they were not only allowed to choose which textbooks were acceptable for teaching history, but they began to write their own. We realized that the textbooks in history and literature, which the children of the South are now studying, are guilty not only of misrepresentations, but of gross omissions, refusing to give the South credit for what she has accomplished, wrote Mildred Lewis Rutherford. As historian of the UDC, and one vitally interested in all that pertains to the South, I have prepared, as it were, a testing or measuring rod. Committees appointed by boards of education or heads of private institutions and their teachers can apply this test when books are presented for adoption, so that none who really desire the truth need be hampered in their recommendation for acceptance or rejection of such books. And so, fictions were created and perpetuated in schools across the country. In 1922, after using David Muzzey's American History textbook for more than a decade, the North Carolina Textbook Commission effectively banned the textbook from school because it taught students that slavery caused the Civil War. A 1957 UDC sanctioned textbook claimed that Virginian enslaved Africans were, quote, generally happy, end quote, and insisted that, quote, Negroes went about in a cheerful manner, making a living for themselves and for those for whom they worked, end quote. A fourth grade textbook suggested that students draw pictures of the Klan and make replicas of the Confederate flag. The white people who had lived in Alabama before the war had no special protection. Read Exploring Alabama, a 1970 textbook on the state's history. They appeared helpless, and many of them were frightened. Finally, some of the people took matters into their own hands. They organized secret societies to help protect their special interests. The best known of these was the Ku Klux Klan. Racist baby comments. But my daddy says the flag represents my Southern heritage. You're from the South. Why don't you like it? Response. Well, R.B., racist baby. In 1948, Southern Democrats walked out of the Democratic National Convention and formed their own party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, more commonly referred to as the Dixiecrats, to protest integration. Soon the flag we now know as the Confederate flag became the symbol that represented the staunch opposition to the liberal values that the civil rights movement was trying to impose on the Jim Crow states. After the University of Alabama was ordered to integrate its campus, the college's Kappa Alpha chapter started flying the flag as a symbol of their heritage and the Southern way of life, prompting most of the school's white fraternities to follow suit. In 1956, Georgia incorporated the banner into its state flag, even though it never represented the state during the Confederacy. South Carolina's General Assembly passed a concurrent resolution to fly the flag at its state house in 1962. None of these states ever mentioned the Civil War in its reasoning for hoisting a flag in honor of the defeated white conduct. Like the KKK, the Kappa Alpha Order, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, their only concern was preserving white supremacy and segregation. Racist Baby's response. Oh, I heard about segregation. My daddy calls it the natural order. Response. I'm sure he does, you brainwashed brat. Anyway, at first, the United Daughters of the Confederacy tried to prevent people from using the blue flag. Not because it was offensive, but because it was inaccurate. But they eventually gave up trying to correct the narrative. Racist Baby. Why'd they give up? Response. Because it was their fault. They were the ones who had promoted the myth of states' rights, of heritage, and this Southern culture. They were the ones who cloaked their anti-black rhetoric into an historical narrative. While the Klan was lynching and the Kappa Alpha members were institutionalizing racism, the United Daughters of the Confederacy were the ones who were rewriting the origin story that recast white supremacist villains as heroes. Racist Baby. But if people have been taught that the Confederate flag represents this heritage, then is this racist? Response. If your dad taught you that he believes 2 plus 2 equals 5, does that mean that everyone else should accept it? Should we change all the calculators to accommodate your dad's incorrect math tutorial? Racist Baby. Wait, I'm still trying to add up 2 plus 2. Response. Well, my point is this. It doesn't matter what anyone believes. The truth is that Confederate monuments celebrate men who committed treason against this country. The current Confederate flag represents a war to preserve the practice of human trafficking, rape, and murder. The only reason it reemerged into the national consciousness is because segregationists wanted to deny black people their constitutional rights. Racist Baby. But if it's so bad, then why does my dad love the Confederate symbol so much? Response. For the same reason 43-year-old dudes tried to tell you about the time they scored 38 points in the high school basketball game, or how guys who pledged a fraternity 27 years ago will throw out their backs trying to put on impromptu step shows at the club as if they are still in college. They have the same sickness that makes Mick Jagger wear skin-tight leather pants, a distorted, delusional self-image cemented in their glory days. Some people stay stuck in the past because the present and future don't look that good. 1865 was about the last time white people were really winning. Since then, they have been engaged in a bunch of diversionary tactics to try to keep the playing field from being level and keep from having to compete against the rest of America without the advantages their whiteness has endowed them with. It is the dread of staring truth and reality in the face and finding out that they were inadequate. It is fear. Racist Baby. So should everything having to do with the Civil War be banned? Response. Of course not. But celebrating the anguish, mistreatment, and subjugation of an entire people is also distasteful. When some people see Robert E. Lee, it reminds them of a deplorable part of American history. Imagine if your tax dollars went to maintaining symbols and history books that reinforce narratives of white supremacy, or having to see a physical representation every day that reminds you of America's continued injustice toward your people. Racist baby. But once all the monuments to and symbols of the Confederacy become shameful, how are we, as Southerners, supposed to remember the Civil War? The same way we remember the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, and every other conflict in American history. With books, we don't need a statue of Saddam Hussein to remember Desert Storm. I don't think the lack of mustachioed enslavers will make us forget the deadliest war this country has ever fought. I know there are people who would rather whitewash the past and romanticize the antebellum days as Southern belles sitting on front porches sipping lit Jewish, but they were also willing participants in an almost 250-year genocide. Maybe one day, out of its racist stupor draped in rebel flags and white supremacist wet dreams, the South will rise again. The racist baby. And then you can come with me to the marshmallow roast? Response: nah, probably not. Okay. Get this book so you can have it in your library. It's 8:21. I am out. I'll see you another day.